You may think you're in 1998. You're not. You're back with me in the 1600s following the strange, complicated, and convoluted path of that little group of religious fanatics. And yep, they were known as religious fanatics in their own era, known to us as the Pilgrims. The first step on the pilgrimage led from the village of Scrooby in the Midlands of England to Amsterdam, which at the time was the most exciting, prosperous, cosmopolitan city in the whole world. They came to Amsterdam because Amsterdam was famous, and Holland in general, the Netherlands in general, were famous for religious toleration. You could do anything you wanted there, and the government wouldn't interfere with you. But there was another reason they came, which is that Holland and the Netherlands had been struggling against the Spanish Catholics for years, and it was identified as a bulwark of an uncompromising sort of Protestant Christianity, the Dutch Reformed Church, that these separatists, as they were called, felt would be much more hospitable to their vision of Christianity than what was going on with what they saw as the utterly corrupt and irredeemable Church of England back home. The problem is that once they arrived at Amsterdam, they saw that though the Dutch could be very fervently religious indeed, the city, Amsterdam, was not at all. It was a city, a seaport city, that even then was famous for its prostitution, was famous for its alehouses. They estimated there were 500 alehouses in the town of Amsterdam alone. And so all of a sudden, these very pious and fervent believers are saying, what are we doing here? Within a year of their arrival in 1607 and 1608, they decided to move again, to pack up everything they had, now rather meager possessions because they didn't have time to establish themselves financially in Amsterdam, and to move to a much smaller city, the university city of Leiden. In Leiden, they got work as weavers. They earned enough money to support themselves and to raise their kids, but they continued to be terribly, terribly worried about their children growing up. What's fascinating about this is there was another group of separatists who had come into Holland about 15 years before the Scrooby separatists, other people who had rejected the Church of England, other people who had a much more pure and idealistic vision of Christianity, called the Ancient Brethren. And what the Pilgrims saw is that the Ancient Brethren, after 20 years in Holland, had basically fallen apart. The kids had been seduced by the commercial culture of the Dutch. The kids were learning the Dutch language. And all of a sudden, another idea began to generate a great deal of enthusiasm from some of the more daring leaders of this tiny little group. Remember, it's a group of about 1,000 people. That's all we're talking about, and that includes some left behind in England and people scattered in different places in Holland, mostly in the city of Leiden. The idea was the wild idea of heading out to Virginia. Now, I have to understand, I know a lot of people today who view Virginia as the center of the earth and covering basically all of the planet. But in those days, when people used the term Virginia, they were referring to everything between Florida and Canada. And that was all Virginia. I guess there are a lot of Virginians today who wish it were still so. What happened here was the idea of getting away from the contaminations of this world, from the persecutions of the Church of England, from the seductions of a very commercial, very materialistic culture in Holland, all of a sudden became very appealing. The problem was, how do you pay for such a voyage? Because in those days, traveling across the ocean, especially if you're going to have some equipment, was tremendously expensive, and these were not by any means wealthy people. So with the approval of John Robinson, who was the charismatic leader and apparently a brilliant preacher, somebody who would deliver 3-hour sermons and people wouldn't even stir. Now, you've got to be a brilliant preacher to be able to do that. John Robinson and others began talking about the possibility of this entire congregation that had gone from England to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Leiden, now making its way to the New World, where they could pursue their godly path without interference and without compromise. How do you get money for it? Well, you apply to a bunch of investors, to businessmen who might like the idea of exploiting a bunch of fanatics like this. Now understand, there was something called the Virginia Company, which had backed the colony at Jamestown with disastrous financial results. The problem with the colony at Jamestown was the people who came over to the first settlement in Virginia in 1607 were basically a bunch of thugs. They were selfishly motivated. There were very few idealists, very few competent people in the group. They thought they would find gold in Virginia. No such luck. The colony struggled and struggled and struggled, but never made any money for the investors. But all of a sudden, these separatists, writing from Holland, send a letter to the Virginia Company saying, hey, look, we're your guys. You should use us. Give us some money, and we'll make you some more money back. And in the letter, they gave the reasons for why it would be such a good investment. They said, we are well weaned from the delicate milk of our mother country, and inured to the difficulties of a strange and hard land, which yet, in a great part, we have by patience overcome. In other words, we've already made it in Holland, so we can make it in this howling wilderness as well. Secondly, they said, the people are, for the body of them, as industrious and frugal, we think we may safely say, as any company of people in the world. By the way, that was true. Then they go forward and they say, we are knit together as a body, in a most strict and sacred bond and covenant of the Lord, of the violation whereof we make great conscience, and by virtue whereof do we hold ourselves straitly tied to all care of each other's good, and of the whole by everyone, and so mutually. In other words, we can stick together. No fighting among ourselves. Lastly, it is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage, or small discontentments cause to wish themselves at home again. The Virginia Company was on the verge of bankruptcy because of the adventure in Jamestown. They didn't put forward the money, but another group of people who were connected with them, led by a bit of a rogue named Thomas Weston, were willing to put forward the money. But here was the deal. Try to imagine this. The deal was that anybody who could invest 10 pounds would have 1 share of final profits. And each one of the pilgrims who went forward and crossed the ocean and labored for 7 years would also get 1 share. So what they were saying was 7 years of your work across the ocean in a dangerous wilderness is going to be worth 10 pounds. Meanwhile, if an immigrant did have some capital to put up 10 pounds and his labor, then he'd be entitled to 2 shares. The deal was made. They began planning. They bought a ship, the Speedwell. Boy, were they excited. I hate to say it, but the Speedwell did not exactly live up to its name. Lots to be scared about, because just 2 years before, another group of separatists had tried to make it to Virginia, led by Francis Blackwell. Of 180 who embarked, 131 died on the voyage, got sick on shipboard. Then the ship returned home. Would the Speedwell and its later companion ship, the Mayflower, fare any better? We shall see.
You're listening to a special edition of The Michael Medved Show on the real story behind Thanksgiving.
And the Pilgrims may have been many things. They may have been great, pious, religious scholars, devoted individuals, remarkably heroic pioneers. They weren't experts when it came to seagoing vessels. That was obvious because they used some of their very limited resources to buy this dump, this tug, this wreck called the Speedwell. It was a craft of some 60 tons, and it was supposed to take them across the Atlantic Ocean. When the small group of separatists, of pilgrims, were getting ready to leave from Holland, the farewells that they said were deeply emotional, mostly because their leader, John Robinson, the pastor, had to stay behind. The bulk of the community was going to stay behind. They were going to send out this advance party across the sea, following the path of a previous expedition, most of whom had died, 131 of whom had died on the voyage of 180 who set out 2 years before. They were going to do all this, so the farewell was quite emotional. At the end of the day, in July of 1620, they had a farewell dinner, celebrating with goose and pudding and wine. They sang their favorite psalms from the Ainsworth Psalm book, the Book of Psalms that they took across the ocean with them, using that intricate madrigal-like harmony that they so enjoyed. Edward Winslow, who was one of the chief men going along on the voyage, described the scene as follows. He said, "We refreshed ourselves after our tears with the singing of psalms, making joyful melody in our hearts, as well as with the voice, there being many in the congregation very expert in music, and indeed it was the sweetest melody that ever mine ears have heard." The next morning, with lots of onlookers, the voyagers all got down to the dock, and when they were at the dock, this is the scene that William Bradford rather emotionally described. The next day they went on board, and their friends with them, where truly doleful was the sight of that sad and mournful parting, to hear what sighs and sobs and prayers did sound amongst them, what tears did gush from every eye, and pithy speeches pierced each other's heart, that sundry of the Dutch strangers that stood on the quay as spectators could not refrain from tears, but the tide, which stays for no man, calling them away, that were thus loath to depart, their reverend pastor falling down on his knees, and they all with him with watery cheeks commended them with the most fervent prayers unto the Lord and his blessing. And then, with mutual embraces and many tears, they took their leaves one of another, which proved to be the last leave to many of them. And then they set sail, and you can imagine people standing on the dock and looking out and watching the ship get smaller and smaller and then disappear from sight. Well, that ship didn't get very far. It was the Speedwell, remember. This was the 60-ton ship that they had bought. What a wreck. The Speedwell met up with the Mayflower. That was another ship that had been provided for the purpose. The Mayflower was from London. That was a ship, much bigger ship. It's a ship of 180 tons. By the way, if you've ever seen the replica of the Mayflower that they have sailing around today, they have it over in Massachusetts. It's a remarkably small ship when you think about 100 people jammed into it. But it was certainly bigger than the Speedwell. It was also more seaworthy. They sailed from London and cleared Southampton and got out about 100 leagues into sea, just 100 leagues past Land's End, when all of a sudden the Speedwell began to sink. This wasn't a good sign. So they turned around and they came back to Plymouth. In Plymouth, they spoke to a number of ship repair people, said, "What can you do to fix up this tub?" And they said, "Well, it's going to cost you a pretty penny." And they didn't have any money. So they applied to Thomas Weston. Remember, he was the investor behind this thing. He was supposed to make money for it. Say, "Look, we need to repair this ship." He said, "Are you kidding? Sell your provisions." So they took some of the provisions they had on barrels on board to help them get through the first winter, and they sold the provisions, particularly a whole bunch of butter and other dairy products that they were supposed to take along for the journey. They sold them, they got the repairs made, they set out again, now with less provisions, and once again, the Speedwell was a disaster. And they decided, well, you're going to have to make it on the Mayflower or not at all. This actually was an excuse for a number of people to say, you know what, maybe this voyage isn't such a great idea. Finally, when they did set sail, on September 16th, 1620, the wrong time to leave, it's getting to be autumn, they were supposed to be crossing during the summer, almost everybody had chickened out except for 35. That's all. The other people on board were either crew members or strangers, people who came along to make barrels or to make beer like John Alden, or just came along because they were adventurers. 35 pilgrims heading across the sea into nothing and nowhere. An amazing adventure, one of the greatest in human history. We'll be back with more.
This is the Michael Medved Show.
There are lots of names from the Pilgrim voyage to the New World that have become famous to us, that we know. Names like Miles Standish, He was also known as Captain Shrimp. He was the military leader of this little pilgrim settlement. Names like William Bradford, the longtime governor, his record of everything that happened is our best source of information. He kept detailed records because he believed that what was going on here was tremendously important. Later published as Of Plymouth Plantation, published, by the way, some 230 years later in the 1850s. This is a real classic of American literature. There's one name with this little pilgrim band that nobody has heard of, but it's a name that deserves the reputation of true hero. The name is Christopher Jones. Christopher Jones, who was that? He was the captain of the Mayflower. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he was a remarkably decent one, and he was so inspired by the devotion and the faith of the men, women, and children, those 35 true believers who, surrounded by a bunch of so-called strangers, people who accompanied them on their voyage to the New World, he was so moved by their devotion and their faith that he was unusually kind to them, as you'll see in a couple of instances. For one thing, he offered, though he was captain of the ship, to bunk with his petty officers and gave his cabin to the women and small children of the Pilgrim band. The rest of everybody else on board the Mayflower, on a surging, turbulent, miserable autumn ocean through September and October, those 102 people were huddled in lantern-lit darkness between decks, often sick, often dealing with stench, no chance really to cook any meals, eating things like salt pork, not tremendously appetizing even under the best of circumstances, but with a rolling, pitching, stinking inferno all around you, this can be particularly miserable. And these pilgrims were also forced to endure another ordeal, and that was harassment from the sailors. The crew did not necessarily take its cue from Captain Christopher Jones. Several of the crew began mocking them unmercifully, and their self-appointed leader had taken such a strong distaste for these pilgrims that he would laugh particularly at their seasickness. He would tell them how much he looked forward to the day when he could sew them up in shrouds and feed them to the fishes. To him, these voyagers were psalm-singing puke stockings. Sounds like the kind of bigotry against intensely religious people that exists in every era. But just at the very peak of his tormenting, this very same crewman suddenly took ill of an unknown fever, and he died in a day. Nobody else caught the disease, and his body was the first one that was sewed into a shroud and tossed over the side to feed the fishes. After that, nobody mocked the pilgrims. That was the end of that. There's only one other person, amazingly, who died in the voyage over. There was a baby born in the voyage over, but only one other person died. That was William Button, a servant, who ignored the urgings of Captain Jones that he ought to drink his daily portion of lemon juice to prevent getting scurvy. He didn't do that. He refused to swallow the sour lemon juice, and that disobedience cost him his life. But meanwhile, at long last, they arrive. Now, they were supposed to arrive in New York. It wasn't called New York then. It was, however, called Manhattan Island. Interestingly enough, the Dutch at one point had been interested in getting these pilgrims to work for them and to settle the mouth of the Hudson River, which the Dutch were already claiming, even though they had no settlement there. But the pilgrims had lived in Holland for a while, but they were still Englishmen, and they preferred working for these English investors. And it seemed like a very good idea. They knew from maps that Manhattan Island would be a good place for them to land. So they headed for that part of Virginia. Remember, all of this is considered part of Virginia at the time. Manhattan Island is considered northern Virginia. It's fascinating to think what would have happened if their navigation had been a bit better, and instead of arriving in Massachusetts, if they had arrived in Manhattan Island, would have probably ended up a very different city than contemporary New York if the Pilgrims had settled there first, but they didn't. They arrived at Cape Cod, and let's put it this way. The initial reaction to the landscape, which was desolate, which was lots of sand dunes and lots of howling wind, well, the initial reaction was, first of all, there was gratitude, of course, because they had made it across the sea, But there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm about what they saw. William Bradford does say that, being thus arrived in a good harbor and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element, and no marvel if they were thus joyful. They thanked God, but then you look around, and this is no place to start a colony. At first, they got back on board the Mayflower, and tried to sail around Cape Cod and to make it to New York, to settle in Manhattan, but the sea simply wouldn't let them. Too many waves, too much wind, and they determined that God wanted them to be there, not in New York. The problem was, this clearly was no place to build a colony. It was too windy, it was too desolate, it was too miserable. So a group of men left the bulk of the people behind and got on a small boat to explore. How bad was it? Well, when those seamen, quote, set out upon further discovery, intending to circulate that deep bay of Cape Cod, the weather was very cold, and it froze so hard as the spray of the sea lighting on their coats, they were as if they had been glazed. The sea spray hitting their clothes, turning to ice, and by the time they returned to their ship, they found that one of the most prominent ladies on the voyage had committed suicide. All of a sudden, crossing the ocean didn't look like the solution to their problems, but maybe just the beginning of their problems. But then there did seem to be at least some blessing provided in terms of the safe harbor they ultimately and improbably found, which we'll tell you about right after this. Sitting off Cape Cod, freezing in late November, early December, it takes 3 weeks to get a small boat ready to explore the area. Finally, when some 14 guys get on board that boat, sail away, leaving the Mayflower behind, with the spray freezing on their clothes, they have a series of adventures, even a skirmish, brief skirmish, with some local natives, Indians, as they were known to the Pilgrims themselves. They finally find what later became the harbor of Plymouth, and later became the site for their colony. They were struck that it was God's providence that had brought them there. They had been rowing and sailing through the night, and then finally the dawn, after they had spent the night on an island, showed this harbor. It looked very promising. There was a slope that had been cleared. There looked like there was room for fields. But there were no people around. There didn't appear to be any natives, either hostile or otherwise, to contest for the property. There were springs. There was a slope up the hill, so the place you could build a good fort and you could defend this area. They then headed back. What's fascinating is, with all of this going on, with the howling wilderness behind them and the cold, they stopped dead one day and didn't do anything. That was because it was Sunday. They were extraordinarily strict Sabbath observers. So they got back to the Mayflower, only to find that William Bradford, one of the men who had been leading this expedition, discovered that his wife, Dorothy, it is said in the records, had fallen overboard and drowned. Nearly everyone who has read these accounts assumes that, staring at this strange, wild, inhospitable, freezing, grim land, missing home and family and warmth and security, she had thrown herself overboard. But there was no time to mourn. The Mayflower went over back to Plymouth, this land that they had found, this mysteriously cleared land. They had even found some corn stored in a metal pot, which could help to keep them alive. They begged of Captain Christopher Jones, "Please stay with us during the winter. We need you here. We need the Mayflower here. We need the men here." Captain Jones, who was supposed to sail back, found his heart melting and decided to stay with the Pilgrims. The winter coming on, they immediately began trying to build some shacks for themselves, some protection, to determine what kind of food they could find. They didn't have enough supplies to last the winter, and in fact, in the winter ahead, half of them died. Remember, we were only talking about 102 people to begin with. Why these 102 people are so crucially important, the adventures they had, and the remarkable intercession of some higher power to keep them alive and allow them to prosper, that is all something that we continue to discuss and describe in this greatest nation on God's green earth. The problem with trying to understand history is that unavoidably, when you're looking at history, you're looking backward. You know how things turned out. You know, for instance, that this tiny little group called the Pilgrims somehow is important to us, tremendously important. We have a holiday in which we celebrate their survival. But if you're sitting there in the winter of 1620 and 1621, freezing to death, starving, watching your best friends, very often your wives, dropping dead around you, you don't know how things are going to turn out. What do you know? You know you are in what is rightly referred to as a howling wilderness. You have no idea whether some of the natives who must be out there somewhere are going to be hostile or friendly. You don't know how you're going to feed yourself, and you don't know emphatically if you are going to survive. After all, these pilgrims who came over to this new continent certainly knew about the lost colony of Roanoke some 30 years before, where an entire colony disappeared without a trace. They knew about a half dozen other attempts to start little settlements or fishing villages in what later became known as New England. These didn't last. They didn't survive. They certainly knew that the winter that they were enduring was far harsher than anything they had experienced in the old country. Who were these people? Well, by and large, they were ordinary, common, hard-working people, but with a real touch of deep piety and even scholarship. Look at William Bradford. William Bradford, who became governor of the colony and wrote the entire record of Plymouth plantation, of this Plymouth colony, had a fascinating life. His father died when he was just a year old, and his mother married again, and his grandfather and uncles took him in hand and trained him as a farmer. At the age of 12, he became a constant reader of the Bible, and when he was just a teenager, he became so moved by the Word of God that he joined this group of rebel Puritans who met for prayer and discussion at the house of William Brewster in this very scenic and picturesque little village of Scrooby. And when that group, inspired by one of their leaders, organized itself into a separate church and got ready to leave England, Bradford joined it despite the, quote, wrath of his uncles and the scoff of his neighbors. Imagine that. A religious rebel, looked down upon by the people around him, largely through his own efforts. This fellow learned Dutch after they moved to Holland, and he also learned a great deal of Latin and Hebrew, and he acquired a wide knowledge of general literature. The most amazing thing is that he brought over with him on the Mayflower, and then had sent to him subsequently, a huge library of books. He lived for books, and lived for writing in his own book the record of what he and the other pilgrims endured. One of the things that he endured is his wife Dorothy throwing herself, so it would seem, off the side of the Mayflower before they had even begun to build those sheds, those huts that would protect them from the winter. Perhaps she had been a Cassandra, seeing the future more clearly than others in that little band, because that winter was grim almost beyond belief and endurance. 6 pilgrims died in December, then 8 in January. On January 14th, they were huddled, sick, hungry. We're not even sure what exactly was the disease that killed so many of them, but it could have been any number of things. Certainly they were malnourished. Certainly a lot of the food they ate was probably rotten. Some of the kernels of corn they had found buried underground, flint corn, not particularly nourishing or good for them. But on January 14th, there was an icy wind, as only a Massachusetts wind can be icy, blowing through cracks in the nearly completed meeting house. Understand that these pilgrims would not build a church. They never, ever had a church. They had a meeting house. In their language, church referred to the group of people who comprised the church. The building was the meeting house. They were gathered in the meeting house, many of them lying on the ground, holding their stomachs, moaning, sick. And suddenly, before anybody knew what was going on, since they were warming themselves with a fire, the thatched roof above them had caught fire, and the interior was filled with smoke. Many people who were helpless with illness started to cry out in horror. The embers and some of the beams began to fall from the roof. Some of the sick people raised themselves with a strength that seemed more than human. Fortunately, most of the timbers did not catch fire, and the building was saved. By the way, they had some casks of gunpowder right there. They could have all been blown to kingdom come had they not put out the fire in time. But during this fire, much of their precious clothing was burned up, and they were further exposed to the harsh New England winter. And still the death toll mounted and added up. In February, they were dying at the rate of 2 a day. 2 deaths every day, people who needed to be buried. Digging in the frozen ground was itself a challenge to bury your friends and family. On some days, 3 died. The 21st of February, 4 people died. At one period, the entire company had only 5 men who were well enough to walk around and care for the sick. One of them was Captain Miles Standish. Standish was not a member of the separatist community. Remember, he was called a stranger. He is someone who had come along for adventure. But he ended up becoming part of the company and a stalwart of the company. He was a little man. His enemies called him Captain Shrimp later. Apparently he was very, very short. He had red hair. He was also called our little chimney because it was easy to get him sparking and flaming. He had a temper. But meanwhile, he was one of the few who didn't get desperately ill. He tended to Bradford, among the others, raising his head up and cradling it in his arm just to spoon him a little bit of soup. Meanwhile, in the harbor, the sailors stayed on the Mayflower. They didn't want to come ashore in the midst of the sickness. They stayed because Captain Christopher Jones, that good and generous man, had listened to the pleas of the Pilgrims to stay around to help them. But people on board the Mayflower were dying as well. One of them, the boatswain, was stricken, described by Bradford as a proud young man who would often curse and scoff at the passengers. But when he grew weak, they had compassion on him and helped him. Then he confessed that he did not deserve it at their hands. He had abused them in word and deed. "Oh," said he, "you, I now see, show your love like Christians indeed to one another, but we let one another lie and die like dogs." In March, another 13 died, but at least that was less than the month before. Finally, when they were able to count the losses, of the 102 people who had crossed the ocean, 47 had died. The biggest toll, the most painful toll, was by March, 13 of 18 wives had died. What those wives had died doing was protecting their children, because the children fared best. All 7 daughters lived, and 10 of the 13 sons lived. But the grown women, they were nearly all gone. And somehow they kept their hopes up, and they kept alive, partially through coming up every Sunday to meet at the meeting house from the little huts they had built separately, listening to the preaching of William Brewster, who assured him that somehow this was all God's will. But finally, by the middle of March, things began to look a bit better, especially when the sun came out, and they knew that spring would not be far behind. There was one particular day in the middle of March. It was a Friday. It was fair, the sky was blue, and they always looked back on that day as a key turning point, even though the day began badly. They were still weak, they were still fearful, when they saw a tall, muscular Indian wearing only a loincloth walking toward them. They shouted out, "Indian coming! Indian coming!" And they approached, carrying their firearms. But as he drew within range, this Indian shouted out in perfect English, "Welcome!" It was a deep, resonant voice. Then they replied, "Welcome." And then, in a fateful interchange, the next word from the Indian is, "Have you got any beer?" And so the encounter continued and followed a shocking and surprising course.
You're listening to a special edition of The Michael Medved Show on the real story behind Thanksgiving.
And part of that real story that you can absolutely use to win any game of Trivial Pursuit is what were the first fateful words in English from Indians to Pilgrims in 1621. And the first fateful words were "Welcome," in a deep, resonant voice in perfect English. "Welcome, have you got any beer?" Well, the Pilgrims didn't have any beer. And what do you say? This Indian walks in from nowhere, and he looks pretty intent on his beer. What they say is, "Our beer is gone. Would you like some brandy?" And the answer, to no one's surprise, was, "You betcha." So they sit down and drink some brandy together. It turns out that this particular Indian is named Samoset. And Samoset was a Sagamore of the Algonquins. He was from up near Maine. He had developed both his English language skills and his taste for beer in contact with a number of the English fishermen who had tried to colonize a little bit, tried to set up some villages, had sailed up and down along the New England coast. He enjoyed spending time with them. He particularly enjoyed their liquid refreshment. And now he told the Pilgrims some fascinating news. The reason that they had been able to establish their settlement in Plymouth where they had, on land that appeared to have been once inhabited, land that was cleared, but with absolutely no human beings anywhere around, is because this was land that had once belonged to the Patuxet tribe. The Patuxet had all died about 6 months before the Pilgrims arrived, in one of those bizarre coincidences, leaving behind this area with springs and cleared land and even some corn stored away. Not a single person seemed to have been left of this small tribe. The nearest tribe was under command of a big chief named Massasoit. And Massasoit, or Massasoit, was not such a big tribe. It was some 600 people, but compared to the 50 or so Pilgrims who were left, that looked pretty formidable. He was, a couple of days' journey away, if you took your time. And what Samoset said that was so particularly interesting is there was a Christian Indian, again, who spoke perfect English, who was living with Massasoit. And soon, as the spring wore on, that Indian, whose name was Squanto, Tisquantum was his actual Indian name. He's known to history as Squanto. He, when he met the Pilgrims, changed everything. Everything. As William Bradford declared in his own recollections, this Indian, Squanto, was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. He directed them how to set their corn, where to take fish, and to procure other commodities, and was also their chief pilot to bring them to unknown places for their profit, and never left them till he died. Squanto's story really begins in 1605. Now, we don't know exactly when he was born, but we know that by 1605 he was a teenager, and he was out hunting with his fellow Native Americans, fellow Indians, when a miserable human being, a miserable excuse for a human being named Thomas Hunt, a one-time colleague of John Smith of Virginia and a sea captain, this Thomas Hunt spotted them. Now, he and his men came ashore, and they took Squanto captive along with 4 of his friends. Why would they want to capture these guys? They captured them and clapped them into irons and took them with other Indians they collected to make money by selling them as slaves. It's absolutely appalling that this was done, of course, but please understand that in the 1600s, slavery was very much an international institution. It was common everywhere in the world, and one of the reasons that it never really flourished as an institution of slavers kidnapping Indians from North America is because so few of those Indians survived that experience. They'd often simply die in the horrors of being transported and the horrors of passage to somewhere else. In any event, Squanto was taken prisoner, he was made into a slave, and he was brought to England, where he worked as a slave, worked as a servant, and lived there in England for 9 years. And as slaves could at the time, he saved little bits of this and that. He worked on his own, and finally he was able to buy his way, partially to talk his way, into freedom. Now, in England, right after he was able to talk his way into freedom, he met Captain John Smith. Right, that same Captain John Smith of Jamestown, the guy with Pocahontas famously. John Smith was getting together a new voyage in 1614 to go back to New England, which of course is where Squanto came from. So Squanto asked if he could get on that voyage and go back to his people. Captain Smith, for a price, of course, agreed, and so Squanto headed back home. He was reunited with his family, he was reunited with his villagers, and of course his heart sang. He was so delighted, he was so thrilled. But his happiness didn't last, because as soon as Captain Smith departed, again, another ship came along, a British ship, with a captain who began capturing slaves. And he particularly wanted Squanto. Why? Because Squanto would be a more valuable slave, precisely because he had learned perfect English. So this time, they clamped him in irons again. They put irons on his legs, they put irons on his arms. He was in chains, a horrible situation. And this time, he wasn't fortunate enough to be taken in slavery to England. He was taken to Spain, and that was much, much worse. It was a disaster, in fact, because the Spanish were known as the most cruel slave masters of that era, particularly when it came to the way they dealt with Indians and Indian slaves. He was taken to Malaga, which was a notorious slave station. His friends were sold to North Africa. They were sold, by the way, for 20 pounds each, which is the equivalent of about $1,400 a head, a lot of money at the time. Now you understand why these people were doing it. So just before they were about to sell Squanto to go to North Africa, where he unquestionably would have worked out the rest of his short life, and life was short for slaves in that circumstance, some Catholic friars appeared on the scene. And these Catholic friars had mercy and they had compassion for people who were in a position like Squanto's in slavery, and they had a Christian attitude, a genuinely Christian attitude toward the slaves. The friars were able to buy and rescue a few of the Indian slaves who were there for sale, including Squanto. So he went to live with the friars in a monastery, and they made him into a Christian. He accepted Christ and became a Christian believer. Now, he never was a particularly well-educated Christian, but he learned to speak perfect English and perfect Spanish. He learned to pray every day and became, at least on one level, quite devout. And with the help of these friars who had befriended him and were impressed by his fine mind and his remarkable character, he got enough money to pay for his voyage back to the New World. Second time going back to that village that he had left, the Pawtuxet village in what is today Massachusetts. He finally arrived just a few months before the Pilgrims got there. He landed in Massachusetts, walked back to his village, and he found it absolutely deserted. He heard the news then that everyone, his brothers, his sisters, his family, his cousins, everyone in his tribe, had all died. In deepest melancholy, Squanto went to live with Massasoit. He had been living with him for several months when Massasoit came in April of 1621 to meet the Pilgrims, and Squanto came along. Now here's my question for you, and it's a profound question. Look at this poor guy. He'd been sold into slavery when he was a teenager. He got out. He managed to get out. Then he got back to the New World. He was captured again and sold into slavery, again taken across the ocean. He was beaten, he was abused, he was misused. No one would have more grounds for hating every single European, anybody with white pale skin. What would be a logical response from Squanto towards these pilgrims that he meets? The logical response are, these are white men, the same kind of men who have abused me, who have harmed me, who have destroyed my life. I want to kill them. I want to poison their water. I want these people to die. These are the people who are responsible, like it or not, for infecting my own tribe with disease. These are the people who've decimated, cruelly imprisoned, and enslaved other Indians up and down New England. I want them all to die. I want nothing to do with them. So what does Squanto do? When, after 2 days of treaties and agreements between Massasoit and the Pilgrims, Massasoit goes back to his home some 50 miles to the southwest, Squanto says, I'm going to stay with the Pilgrims, and I'm going to live with them. What? Can you imagine? He's not enraged? He's not embittered by his victimization? No, he's not, as a matter of fact, because Squanto learned, and he demonstrates in his life, perhaps the most important lesson that any American in the 1620s or in the 21st century can learn about race, which is that the important thing is not what race you are, it's what character you have. It's not the color of your skin. It is, as Dr. King says, the content of your character. Squanto had seen, of course, that white men were very different from one another. There were white men who enslaved him, and there were white men like the good friars who rescued him, who showed kindness, who showed decency. He clearly could see into the hearts, into the minds, into the souls of the Pilgrims. He saw that they were good men, like the friars, and he wanted to be with them. He wanted to live with them. He wanted to pray with them. He wanted to be a part of their community. Is there any more important lesson about the Thanksgiving story? I don't really think so. The lesson here is that you can be a Native American, not just seeing your tribe victimized, but yourself victimized, and yet you can understand this highest principle of America, that you judge people based on who they are and what they do and how they act, not the color of their skin, not the nature of their background. Squanto did that. He immediately began helping the Pilgrim Fathers, and helping them to such a remarkable degree that most historians will agree that it was his ministrations, his activity, as much as anything, that kept the Pilgrims alive in those early months. He was there for the first spring, their first planting. He was able to help them, to show them, famously, how you used herring, and how that was the kind of fish they apparently used. You planted the herring along with the corn. You put it in the ground to fertilize the corn as it grew. He showed them how to catch fish and how to catch eels. The eels actually were an important part of their diet. And with all of this, he helped them, as well as helping them communicate with Massasoit, the nearby chief, and to make sure that there would be no harsh relations. He was held to be, and was indeed, a blessing for them, living with the Pilgrims and enabling them to survive from the moment he met them until the time he died just a few years later. But clearly, the Pilgrim story, the Thanksgiving story, is very largely Squanto's story, too. Think about the losses on both sides. Half of the Pilgrim band and the strangers who had come with them had died in the wintertime. All of Squanto's people had died. They clearly needed each other, and his value absolutely couldn't be exaggerated. No wonder so many of the Pilgrim Fathers remained convinced that there had been some divine providence involved here. Try to think about this for a moment. I mean, the chances of finding a fervently Christian Indian who would provide them with help. And with the harvest that they planted, and with the summer going forward, they actually were doing much better. Was it a flourishing colony? By no means. You're talking about a remarkably small number of people who were greatly enhanced and helped by this Squanto. But they were happy enough at the end of the spring and the summer of their planting to want to celebrate their survival and the fact that things were looking up. And so they called a day of Thanksgiving, and they invited Chief Massasoit. That seemed like a politic thing to do. They had enough to serve. They actually caught some wild fowl, apparently. They had some vegetables that they had grown. They had some corn. They did not have popcorn. That is a myth. It's not true. They didn't. But the problem is, when Massasoit arrived for this feast, which we don't know exactly the date, but it was sometime in October of 1621, the first Thanksgiving, when Massasoit arrived, it's sort of, guess who's coming to dinner in Plymouth in 1621? It's Massasoit, oh yeah, with 90 of his braves. Let me tell you, those guys came with an appetite. This wasn't tremendously good news for the four only women who had to provide for all these guys. We'll tell you how they did it right after this.